Okay, let's talk about applying the concept or usage of your contour slopers or guidelines to a design. One of your assignments this week is to actually do design 1 here on page 171, which is written out in instructions, step-by-step instructions with diagrams for you to be able to do design 1. I thought I'd maybe demonstrate the application of the guidelines, though, here with design 2, help you kind of visualize it and expand your knowledge of different layouts of design lines and things. So for this one, it is a very deep V neck. And so if we think about where that V is going and relate it to the sloper from our shoulder coming down super deep, you can see it's crossing over some guidelines. And then I'm going to show you what you do with that guideline once it crosses over. All right, so another thing that I want to look at here is an indicator on the book. If this is my bust level in the diagram, I can see that my center front is actually going below it and also almost below the lower curve of the bust or breast there, up into our empire waist, which we can then put together. There's no waist dart here, so I'm going to show you how we would put these sections back together as well. So why don't we go ahead and plot that on here real quick. Okay. So I know from down here it was coming to about lower than the waist or under the bust level. And I'm going to square that off from center front on over here. And whatever that measurement is there, I'm actually going to bridge the gap of my dart legs, which should bring me to here. And same thing with that measurement. Also keep it going so that all the way around over to the side. And I know that that kind of looks like it's humped, but I am staying parallel to the bottom curve of my bodice. So laying in that plot line. I'm only doing mine in pink so you can see it on the camera much easier. Now for what's going on across the neckline here. And I want to look at my picture and see, well, guesstimating how far out on the shoulder it goes. Same thing from the shoulder tip in. Where is that strap happening? And I'm going to pick some spots. I'm going to make my strap, about 1.5 inches wide. So there, and I'm kind of centering it over my mid-neck. Okay, next thing here. Going to strike a line from here to there, from my shoulder down to center front, because the design they met right at center front on that midsection here. Same thing now also for my side seam. Now my side seam, or armhole, excuse me, may drop just a little bit under the arm. So let's bring that down. So I'm looking under her arm here. I'm going to bring that down about 3/4 of an inch. And then here is the mark up here and on around. Oh. There we go. Sorry about the lights. Coming on around this curve. Okay, so I've got my guidelines in there, or my style lines, the new edges I want, and they are crossing over several guidelines. So let's cut away what we don't need. We're going to get rid of this section here, making it a V-neck to the pattern. On up. There we go. Getting rid of that. Now around my armhole curve. Okay, on up. There we go. Now this lines, plotted lines here, are my seam line that are underneath the center front to the midriff. Now by clipping these and on over, so these were a each side of my dart leg. I'm going to close up my dart, matching these up. Now, with those guidelines, that would be my closed dart legs, but I want that to fit real snug under the bust, so I am going to match it up at the bottom, and where these guidelines match up and overlap, that gray area that would be in between those guidelines, I'm lining up those lines here, okay? And so on. So this becomes my center front edge. I can quickly mark that with my 3 dots or a CF, and this is my front midriff. Now I'm not done yet. I still have my grain lines to put on, my seam allowance to put on to be able to cut it out of fabric and everything. Probably even kind of true up this bottom edge. I'll do that in a little bit. I want to spend more focus though on how are we going to deal with these guidelines that these lines cut over. And then in here was my dart space, okay? This space right in there is the dart space. So let's go ahead and remove it on the pattern. There we go. Okay. I'm going to slash on guideline number 1 and close up that opening gap in between that space. Now, depending on wherever my deep V or my deep scoop cross that guidelines, it may be a larger space or a narrower space, but because of where it falls on the body form relation to the pattern, that will tell me the distance of what I'm going to be overlapping those. And when I go to overlap that and close that up, come on paper, work with me. There it goes. Okay. It's actually spreading this one wider. But I'm doing this on my paper pattern. I don't wait and do it on the fabric later. I know that's how I demonstrated the concept to you, showing you on the dress form, but that wasn't a finished pattern. That was just a sloper pattern over a 3-dimensional space, shape, body shape. So it will stagger off like that. That is where later we're going to come back in and true up that line. Okay. Now I'm going to do my next guideline here because the armhole curve crossed over those guidelines, and that happens to be guideline number 2. Whoops. Oh, they got stuck in my scissors. There we go. Okay, so now closing this up to touch and close those spaces. Okay. Now I shaded mine in gray so that you could see it on the camera a little bit better. You don't have to, but it does make it easier to recognize that space in there until you get very comfortable with this. And then my last one here, which happens to be guideline number 3 in the lower curve of this armhole. Okay, so closing up the space between those 2 guidelines where that new armhole shape crossed over. Okay, so now we have these little edges that we're going to true up those lines before adding the seam allowance. This little space under here, when I look back at my diagram, it is a dart equivalent being utilized with gathers for my dart excess there. So we will show you that here in just a minute. Let me get that prepped and ready. Right, adding on our seam allowances onto our pieces, as well as truing up any little spots that might just not be the smoothest of lines. So I've taken the midriff section here and already taped it onto another piece of paper a little bit larger. Now my center front, according to my sketch, would be on the fold. So if you recall from pattern making class prior to this, is that something placed on the fold does not get seam allowance on the outside of it, and the grain line is drawn with the arrows bent and touching the edge that goes on the fold. Now then, I'm truing up my edges here. So my bottom kind of had a little dip right there. So truing it up would be kind of aligning my ruler such that if I came across there, I'd straighten up that line, getting rid of that little tip right there. I don't need to cut it away, but I will now be using this new straightened line for the line that I will adjust my seam allowance off of. And in this case, I'm giving it a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Remember, we're in full size. Now, on the side piece of our contour pattern, we also shave a little bit off here. And if you recall that on the side seams of the one you made there, and I grade that out. So I will use this inner line as my stitching line. I didn't cut that away yet because I wanted you to see it, but I don't, I could save myself the step of that. It's this line in here that I'm going to make my stitching line. So from that one referenced is going to be my seam allowance outside of that, 1/2 inch. And now coming up over this top edge here. Okay, coming around. I didn't really need to true anything up on this part. It seemed all right. There we go, finishing out any of my markings mid-drift. I need to cut one on fold. What size did you use? If you're using your sloper, it was a size 8. We will come back and add some notches on here after we figure out our notches for the top part. Okay, now the guidelines that we cover or closed up where our new neckline and armholes crossed over. I've taped that down, but they're still a little staggered. It's probably a little hard to see here in the video, but they're a little staggered. I need to true that up. And I'm going to kind of really play it by ear or eyeball in the sense, do I want to trim away one whole edge of that, just blending off of one line into the other? Or would I find maybe the middle of the space that overlaps and kind of blend it from here to here? On my armhole, I am going to go ahead and go to one side of it and blending that away. That'll be what I will use. This one down here didn't have too much of a difference, so it'll be fine. Now then, the center front neck though, I will probably shave a little bit off of that one and come outside of where that one sits to blend this part. So this will be my new line that I'm following when I put my seam allowance on. Okay, hopefully you can see that in the video. And going with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. Now, on the shoulder, when we got tiny straps, do you ever have problems of straps falling off your shoulders? Well, the pattern maker probably did not do an adjustment for the guidelines up there. It does dip in or come in a little bit tighter, and on either side where I cut it off, that's the measurement I actually want to use. Straighten that off, and from there is where I strike my seam allowance. It just shortens it a little bit so that that strap sits nice and tight over your shoulder and won't be slipping off. All right, just for my ease of drawing, flipping my pattern upside down and using my ruler as I rotate. Use a smaller one getting around this curve. Around here, still maintaining 1/2 inch from my new armhole edge. And remember, on the lower part, we use this inside guideline here so that it sits nice and snug under the armhole. And that's what I strike my 1/2 inch off of. Okay. Down here, I want my dart not sewn as a dart, so I do not need a dart point. I will not notch the legs of the dart. I actually want it to be a dart equivalent of gathers in this space. And when doing gathers, you usually come outside of that anywhere from 1/2 inch to 1 inch wide. I'm just going to look at a quick guideline here. Or even 1.5 inches. It can go, you can kind of gauge it as you want. So tell you what, we'll just go 1 inch on either side of this. So 1 inch, and over here 1 inch. So that's where I'll use my notchers. Once I have trimmed this out on the line, I can get my notcher in there, notch those. I want those notches to equal back into this space on either side of here. So what, I went about 1 inch on either side, so there and there. So that is when I gather this up, if you remember gathers from sewing class, bunch that down, match my notches here, everything else should match at side seam and center front in order to make that design. Now in the book, the design also, get the book over here, these were nice. The designer gave you a back view to know what are you doing with the back on these. I'm not going to go into that right now. The front had quite a bit there on applying use of your guideline contour pattern. So anytime you cross those guidelines, you're slashing to close the guideline and letting that excess spread out further and further in your dart space. Now then, this design, design 1, is the one that is your third assignment this week, and it does have instructions to be able to do the front and the back and this sheared waistband as well. All right. If you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me, and I'd be happy to either meet you online or talk to you over the phone, whatever is working best for you to keep you working on all this and getting it. Good luck.